A navigator does not die the moment they lose the light. This is important to understand. They die before that and after that and during it, but not at the moment you think. The Imperium of Man does not waste things. It cannot afford to. 10,000 years of empire have taught it that if something can be used, truly, fully, completely used, then it must be used, even if what is being used is a human being. Especially then. The empire is vast, you see, incomprehensibly vast. There are 12 billion worlds that know the Emperor's name. There are trillions of humans who have never seen anything larger than their birth hive. There are systems where the light from the sun has never reached, where it is always nighttime, where the cold is so profound that it has a kind of presence to it. In a universe this large, waste is not an option. Waste is death. Waste is the thing that the Imperium fears most, because the Imperium understands, has learned across 10,000 years and thousands of dead worlds, that if it begins to waste, it will never stop. The decay will accelerate, entropy will take hold, and everything will collapse. So nothing is ever truly wasted, even failure, especially failure. So let us begin not with a person, but with the system that holds them. Let us understand how the machine works before we understand what it does to those caught within its gears. The Astronomicon burns in the palace of the Emperor on Holy Terra. This is not poetic language. It burns. The light that guides every starship, every merchant vessel, every war cruiser, every pilgrim transport across the vast darkness of space, this light is fed by psychers. They sit in meditation chambers beneath the golden throne itself, thousands of them, their minds open to the warp, their souls burning like candles in the dark sometimes, so that others might not be lost. These psychers are not chosen for any particular excellence. They are chosen because they are sufficient, because their psychic strength is adequate to the task, because the Imperium can afford to burn them. They sit in those chambers for years, sometimes. Their minds slowly deteriorate, their bodies atrophy. Some of them go mad. Some of them simply burn out, their psyker power consuming them from within until there is nothing left but ash. But in those years, or months, or whatever time they have left, they feed the Astronomicon. They keep the light burning. And when they can no longer continue, when their minds are too broken, their strength too depleted, their link to the warp too damaged, they are removed, replaced. A new psyker takes their place. The old one is either destroyed mercifully or kept alive in some institution, cared for minimally, until their body simply ceases to function. The Astronomicon does not fail often. When it fails completely. It does not dim gradually. It does not provide warnings. It simply stops. One moment the light is burning across the stars, reachable by any navigator within reasonable distance, and the next moment there is darkness. And in that darkness, ships that were confidently navigating through the warp suddenly find themselves directionless, blind, lost. But the Astronomicon is not what keeps ships from being lost. The light helps. The light matters. But what truly guides ships through the horror of the warp are navigators. A navigator is a thing of careful breeding. For 10,000 years, the great navigator houses have culled their own bloodlines, selecting for the mutation that allows their kind to perceive the warp not as it is, but as it might be navigated. They carry in their blood, quite literally, in the exotic geometry of their skulls and eyes, and the secondary organs grown against their spines, the ability to feel the currents of reality the way a fish feels water, the way a drowning man feels the depth pulling him down. But a navigator is not simply a mutant. A navigator is a tool that has been refined and perfected across millennia. Every bloodline in the navigator houses has a history measured in centuries. Every genetic line has been selected for specific traits: psychic sensitivity, mental resilience, the ability to focus consciousness in ways that normal humans cannot achieve. The ancient Terran bloodlines pride themselves on their purity. The newer houses, established in the last 3,000 years, work desperately to match the quality of the ancient lines. To be a navigator is to be part of a hierarchy that predates the Imperium itself. Some houses are greater than others. Some bloodlines are more valued. The distinction between a master of one house and a tool of another house can be vast, even though both technically serve the same function. But in the end, they are all tools, all resources, all ultimately disposable, though some are more easily replaced than others. There are perhaps 3,000 navigators in the entire Imperium at any given moment. Not 3,000 per faction, not 3,000 in active service, 3,000 total across all 12 billion worlds, across the entirety of human space. 3,000 individuals, each one cultivated across decades, trained across years, shaped by houses and tradition and the weight of 10,000 years of expectation. A single trade fleet moving between stars requires at least one navigator to plot a course through the warp. APS 90. Some larger expeditions carry 2 or 3 or more. Military expeditions might carry 5 or 6 or even more, depending on the route and the risks expected. This means that on any given day, hundreds of navigators are in the warp, guiding ships. Most of them return, some do not. The loss rate is carefully calculated. The Imperium accounts for it. For every 100 navigators sent into the warp, perhaps 95 will return, perhaps 90. The number varies. The houses track it. They know their own rates. They know which bloodlines are more reliable. They know which routes are most dangerous. But the math always works out. The system always accounts for the losses. Because the losses are not seen as failures. The losses are seen as the system functioning as designed. When a navigator fails, when they lose their way in the warp, when the light from the Astronomicon becomes too distant or too faint, or simply ceases to mean anything to their altered perceptions, what happens is not what most people imagine. There is no dramatic rupture, no sudden scream across Vox systems, no final prayer broadcast to the cold of space. There is silence. There is the slow realization that the currents have changed. There is the understanding that the geometry of the warp, which should flow in certain ways, has become alien. There is the knowledge, dawning like an infection, that you are no longer moving toward Terra. You are moving toward something else. Toward a place where the warp does not thin before you into real space. Toward a place where the light has become something else entirely. Toward a place where the only guidance is the guidance that comes from within, from the parts of your mind that are no longer entirely your own. What a navigator experiences in these moments is not something the Imperium worries about. The Imperium is vast and old, and has learned not to waste effort worrying about the inner experiences of those in its service. What the Imperium worries about is the ship. The Imperium worries about the cargo. The Imperium worries about whether the crew will arrive at their destination, even centuries late, even full of mutations, even changed in ways that require careful handling and immediate quarantine protocols. The Imperium worries about whether the investment was worthwhile. The navigator themselves, what they experience, what they become, what happens to the part of them that was human and aware and afraid, this is classified as a loss of function. A system failure, a cost of operation. The same way a manufacturing plant accounts for tool wear, the same way a war fleet accounts for casualties. It is expected, built into the calculations, already paid for by the houses and the military bureaucracies that employ them. This is how the system works. It is vast, it is old, it is impersonal, and it is, in its own way, perfect. Navigator Castor Venn had been born into the Navigator House Venn 300 years before his birth, if you understand what that means. Which is to say, his bloodline had been cultivated, selected, modified, and refined for 300 years before he drew his first breath. His entire body was not his. It was an inheritance, a tool, an instrument of the house's will and profit. He understood this from infancy. Understanding it was part of his training. His eyes, both the forward-facing pair and the secondary oculi nested in the flesh of his temples, had been measured and assessed before he could focus them. His neural architecture had been tested. The organs grown against his spine, the ones that let him perceive the warp, had been examined for efficiency and sensitivity. By the time he was old enough to walk, Castor Venn knew that he was a successful design. He was valuable. He was exactly what the house needed. He was also, therefore, expendable. This was not a contradiction. The Imperium does not see contradictions in these things. Castor was trained as all navigators are trained, in meditation, in the perception of deep space, in the reading of the warp's currents and moods, in the ancient mathematics of interstellar navigation that predated even the dark age of technology. He learned the prayers that must be spoken. He learned the rituals that must be observed. He learned that the warp is not safe, not knowable, not something that can be truly understood, only navigated around, avoided, tricked into carrying you toward reality. He was considered excellent at this. His instructors noted his particular gift for sensing the subtle shifts in the warp that indicated a route beginning to deteriorate. His mind, or what the house called his mind, though it was really something else, something that had been cultivated like a garden, was flagged as showing particular aptitude. At 43 years old, with more than 50 successful transits through the warp behind him, Castor Venn was one of the most reliable navigators in his house. Reliability in the house meant more assignments, more wages paid to the house, not to Castor, more risk, more exposure to the warp's attention, more chances to fail. But navigators are trained not to think of it as risk. They are trained to think of it as duty, as honor, as the greatest calling a human can possibly achieve, to stare into the darkness and bring your people safely to port. The ship Castor served on, as his most recent assignment, was the Infinite Prospect. A merchant vessel of the Merlant Trading Collective, she was old by the standards of active commerce. 370 years since her keel was laid. Her engines had been rebuilt, replaced, rebuilt again. Her hull had been patched so many times that little of the original remained. She was exactly the sort of ship that had carried humanity across the stars for millennia. She was also exactly the sort of ship where corners were cut. The navigator's chamber aboard the Infinite Prospect was a small room, not uncomfortable. Navigators were valuable enough to be housed with a certain minimum of dignity. There was a meditation pool, treated with oils that helped sensitivity to the warp. Oils that had been expensive. Oils that had been imported from monasteries on worlds the crew would never visit. Oils that smelled of incense and metal and something else that was difficult to identify. Something organic and vaguely chemical that the house did not like to discuss. There was a chair, ergonomic and modified to accommodate his secondary organs, designed by craftsmen whose names had been lost centuries ago. There was a console that displayed the most crucial information about the ship's current trajectory, fuel consumption, and the status of the Astronomican's signal. There were prayer scrolls, written in High Gothic, containing words that had been spoken by navigators since the founding of the houses. There were astronomical charts, hand-drawn and updated by each successive navigator, showing the routes between stars and the dangers known to lie along those routes. There were no windows. Navigators never saw where they were going. They existed in a sensory place between thought and dream, between the physical universe and the warp itself, between light and dark. Windows would have been useless. They might have been maddeningly distracting. When the Infinite Prospect made ready for the warp transit that would define the remainder of Castor Venn's existence, he performed the rituals he had performed dozens of times. He cleansed himself in water treated with the same oils as the meditation pool. He meditated, moving from ordinary consciousness into that state of heightened awareness that navigators cultivated. He touched the holy oils to his temples and the secondary oculi there, and he whispered the prayers of opening, old words, older than the Imperium itself, words that predated even High Gothic, words that meant something once and now meant only habit. Or perhaps habit was all they had ever meant. Perhaps that was the entire point. The prayers did not unlock mystical powers. They simply put the navigator's mind in the right state. They simply created the discipline required to navigate. The ship's master came to see him before the transit. This was unusual. Castor noted this. Captain Renard was not a man given to sentiment. He was 52, had captained merchant vessels for 30 years, and had learned not to think of his cargo, his crew, or his navigator as anything more than variables in an equation of profit and loss. "The route is long," Captain Renard said. He had a way of speaking to navigators that suggested he was giving instructions to a machine. 18 standard months if conditions are favorable. The last navigator's logs suggested some instability around the Vex run, but nothing critical. Standard precautions should suffice. Castor nodded. He was already beginning to drift into the state of opening. It took time, hours usually. The transition from consciousness to that place between places where a navigator operated. The warp did not yield to haste. You are cleared to begin transition at the hour, Captain Renard continued. He paused, added, Your house has already been paid for this transit. Good performance will result in a secondary bonus. Failure will result in a secondary payment in other forms. This was how the houses communicated such things. Politely, indirectly. But the meaning was absolute. Perform well, or your house will extract payment from your family, your bloodline, your future assignments. I understand, Captain, Castor said. His voice was already becoming distant. The meditation was already beginning. Captain Renard left. Castor did not watch him go. He was already moving into the place between me. The first sign that something was wrong came at approximately the 4-month mark. Not wrong, perhaps. That was too strong a word. Unusual. The warp's mood had shifted. What should have been a clear current through a well-mapped region had become textured, layered, something that required more attention to navigate safely. Castor compensated. This was what he was trained for. This was what his entire existence had been arranged to do. The warp is never the same twice. This was the first lesson every navigator learned. Currents shift. The deep dark that underlies reality is in constant motion, constant change, responding to things that navigators can sense but never fully understand. You adjust. You accommodate. You do not fight it. Fighting it is death. Fighting it is worse than death. The training of a navigator was designed with this principle in mind: adaptability without resistance. Navigators were taught not to impose their will on the warp, but to read the warp's will and move with it. It was sometimes described in poetic terms as a kind of dance, but the poetry obscured a darker truth. It was surrender. It was the complete sublimation of personal desire to external force. It was the training of consciousness to exist in a state of constant acceptance. This training began in childhood. A navigator-to-be would be shown the nature of the warp through meditation and sensory deprivation and controlled exposure to psychic phenomena. They would learn to feel the pull of reality's seams. They would learn to sense the presence of currents that should not exist. They would learn to understand that their own consciousness was not a separate thing looking out at the warp, but a part of the warp itself, and that this dissolution of boundary was not dangerous but liberating. And once they understood this, truly understood it in every fiber of their being, they would no longer fear the warp. They would no longer resist it. They would simply navigate it the way a sailor navigates the sea, not by fighting it, but by becoming part of it. This training had worked on Castor perfectly. He had accepted it completely. He had never questioned it. He had never resisted it. He had become exactly what the house wanted him to become. The Astronomican's light remained constant in his perception, a distant beacon, pale but present. As long as that light existed, a navigator could navigate. As long as he could perceive it, he was not lost. This was the fundamental comfort of existence for a navigator, that the light would remain. It was distant enough to seem almost mythical, bright enough to be real, constant enough to be trusted. A navigator's meditation was built on that light. Everything that kept the ship moving in the right direction flowed from the understanding that somewhere, across impossible distances, there burned a light that was meant for them. But the light was dimmer than it should have been. This troubled him, though he did not allow the trouble to show in his reports to the captain. A dimmer light could mean many things. It could mean the Astronomican's output had decreased. Unlikely, but not impossible. It could mean they were farther from Terra than the route suggested, a possibility but one with simple solutions. It could mean that the local space was dense with the kind of warp stuff that dampened perception. The most likely explanation, actually. None of these were critical. All could be navigated around. The machinery of navigator training had taught him to decompose problems into component parts and handle each separately. Do not panic. Do not lose focus. Treat each change as information, not as threat. He did note it in his personal log. For the records, for the house, for whomever came after him, if after came to be relevant. This last thought was meant to be professional, archival. But some part of Castor recognized it for what it actually was, an acknowledgement that if he made a serious error, if his ability to navigate failed at some point, whoever replaced him would need to understand the path he had been trying to take. The instability around the Vex run, that Captain Renard had mentioned almost casually before the transit began, proved more substantial than the last navigator's logs had suggested. This was not unusual. The warp was not a still thing. It had seasons, if you could call them that, moods, long-term patterns of behavior. The Vex run might have been stable when the last navigator passed through 3 years ago. It was considerably less stable now. The currents had deepened. Some cosmic event, some psychic disturbance, some change in the fundamental geometry of that region of space had made the path more dangerous. This was manageable. Castor adjusted course, not drastically. A series of subtle corrections, each small enough not to require permission from the captain, each sufficient to move the ship around the worst of the interference. He had done this dozens of times. The warp required constant small corrections. This was normal. This was manageable. Still, it took more of his attention, more of the specialized awareness that kept him balanced between the physical and the warp. He spent longer in meditation, longer in that state where his human consciousness became more of a passenger, observing the work being done by the parts of him that the house had cultivated specifically for navigation. 4 months became 6 months. The ship was behind schedule, not catastrophically. The ranges of acceptable deviation for a warp transit were generous. Months could be lost without serious concern. But the captain's messages became tighter, more frequent. The tone shifted from instruction to something that sounded almost like encouragement, except that encouragement in the captain's voice sounded more like threat. "The House has invested considerable resources in this transit," came a message, received via the communication choir and transmitted to Castor's meditation chamber. "Continue to demonstrate the excellence your record suggests." Castor understood. The message was not for him. Messages transmitted through the communication choir were never truly for their stated recipient. They were for the other navigators, the house, the crew, the universe itself. They were prayers, essentially. Prayers that said, "This navigator is performing his duty. This navigator will not disappoint. This navigator is worth what we are paying." If the captain had not sent such a message, the implication would have been clear: this navigator is failing. Castor did not fail, but he was tiring. A navigator's meditation was not restful. It was a constant state of tension, of attention, of balancing between states of being. Weeks and months in that state accumulated. A wariness that was not physical, but something deeper, something that affected the very perception that made him valuable. At 6 months, the route stabilized. The Vex run became negotiable again. The current he was navigating began, slowly, to match the expectations of the charts. The light of the Astronomicon, while still dimmer than it should have been, began to feel more familiar. Castor filed a report to the captain. Current trajectory suggests arrival within acceptable parameters. Estimated transit time, 18 to 22 standard months, all systems nominal. All systems nominal. This was the phrase that meant, everything is proceeding as it should. Nothing is failing. The machine is functioning. It was also the phrase that meant the captain would make his decisions based on this information, based on the assumption that the navigator was competent, that the route ahead was clear, that the light would continue. It was also the phrase that, once transmitted, meant that nothing else the navigator said would matter very much unless something catastrophic occurred. The catastrophe, when it came, did not announce itself. At 8 months into the transit, the Astronomicon's light simply ceased, not dimmed, not faded gradually. It stopped existing in the way that a navigator perceived it. One moment it was present, pale, distant, but anchoring everything, and the next moment it was gone. Castor's perception shattered. This is the most accurate way to describe it. A navigator's awareness of the warp is built on the foundation of that light. It is the anchor to reality. It is the proof that they are not completely lost in the dark. When it ceases, the consciousness that was navigating by its illumination finds itself suddenly adrift. He understood in that moment what was happening. The Astronomicon did not fail. It was never supposed to fail. But in the rare moments it did, maintenance cycles, power fluctuations, the rare and devastating times when those who tended it died, the light simply ceased. Or perhaps the light had not ceased. Perhaps the infinite prospect had simply moved beyond the place where the light reached. This too was possible. Not common, not desirable, but possible. Castor initiated emergency protocol. This meant several things. First, inform the captain. Second, begin trying to navigate by secondary means, by the pure perception of the warp itself, without the anchoring light of the Astronomicon. Third, conserve psychic strength for what was likely to be a very long journey, back to any place where the light existed. His message to Captain Renard was calm. This was training. A navigator, even in crisis, maintains composure. The Astronomicon has ceased to be perceptible. This indicates either a disruption of its signal or a significant drift in our position. Initiating secondary navigation protocols. Current trajectory is uncertain pending further assessment. What he did not say, but what the captain was trained to understand, was, we are lost. We do not know where we are. We do not know if we can get back to where we should have been. We do not know if we will arrive anywhere inhabited by the Imperium at all. What Castor did not know, and would not learn for some time, was that the Astronomicon had not failed. The light was still burning 300 light-years away. The infinite prospect had simply moved, not through the warp in the normal sense, but through it, into regions that the warp itself did not normally access, into spaces that existed in that dimension in the way that eddies exist in water, present but not stable, not mapped, not navigable by the conventional routes. The ship had been pulled. This would later be explained as a power surge in the warp drives, a fluctuation in the geometries that were supposed to protect the vessel from the warp's full attention. An equipment failure that was theoretically impossible, but that had, in practice, occurred. It did not matter why it had occurred. What mattered was that it had, and the infinite prospect now existed in a place that was not on any map. Captain Renard's response came within the hour. Continue navigation to standard endpoints. Presumed signal disruption. Astronomicon may resume contact. Continue at present speed. House authority confirms. Maintain course and arrive on scheduled date if possible. This message contained several kinds of desperation, none of them overtly expressed. This was the way of the Imperium's bureaucracy. Desperation hid under layers of formality. The first kind of desperation the message contained was this. The captain was hoping the Astronomicon would resume contact, because without it he had no authority in the warp. A captain commanded his ship, a navigator commanded the path. When the path no longer existed, the captain became merely the administrator of a drifting object. He had no more power to affect events than a brick floating in a river. The second kind of desperation, contained in the phrase, "House authority confirms," meant that Castor Ven's own house had been consulted and had declared that failure was not acceptable. The house's reputation depended on the navigator's performance. If this transit failed, if the infinite prospect never arrived, if the crew died or was lost or arrived in some distant future age, it would reflect poorly on House Ven. It would suggest that the house's bloodline was unreliable. It would cost them contracts. It would cost them profit. It would cost them status. The third kind of desperation, contained in the careful phrase, "if possible," meant that the captain understood perfectly well that arriving on schedule was no longer possible, but that the declaration made the failure slightly less the captain's fault, since the navigator had been given an order he could not obey. It was a way of documenting that the failure, when it came, was not the captain's responsibility. It was a way of spreading the blame. The fourth kind of desperation, which did not need to be stated because it was understood by everyone in the system, was this. The crew could not know the truth. They had to be kept in hope. They had to believe that rescue was possible. They had to believe that the navigator would find the way. Because if they lost hope, if they abandoned belief, they would fragment. They would riot. They would die. Castor understood all of this. Understanding was his job. What he did not do was reply to tell the captain that none of these things mattered, that the Astronomicon would not return, that the standard endpoints might not exist anymore, that the scheduled date might be 1,000 years in the future or 10,000 years in the past, or might exist in a configuration of reality so altered that the concept of scheduled had become meaningless. Navigators did not tell captains these things. Navigators did not say, "We are lost." Navigators did not say, "I do not know the way." Navigators did not say, "The system has failed." Instead, Castor Ven began to navigate. For a time, and it is difficult to express how long this time was because time in the warp is not a stable thing, and a navigator's perception of it is even less stable. Castor searched. He searched in the way that navigators search, by extending his awareness into the warp, by feeling for currents that might lead somewhere, by reading the geometry of reality itself for signs of the structure that humanity had built around its empire. He was looking for the Astronomicon. He was looking for the light. He was looking for the way home. He did not find it. What he found instead were echoes of it, signals that had been reflected or bent or distorted as they traveled through the warp's depths. Memories of light, perhaps. Ghosts of guidance that had no meaning except to remind him of what he was searching for. He followed them because they were all he had, and following them required less attention than simply floating in the dark and acknowledging that there was no direction, that his training was meaningless, that he was what he had always secretly feared he was, utterly, completely, fundamentally lost. But lost is a state of mind. It is an acknowledgement. And a navigator's entire training is built on the principle that you never acknowledge loss, you never surrender, you never admit that you do not know the way, because to admit it is to prove it, to acknowledge it is to become it. So Castor did not acknowledge it. Instead, he navigated. The ship drifted. This is also important to understand. A ship in the warp does not simply float like a ship on water. The warp does not have a stable medium. It does not have density or viscosity or the normal physical properties that would allow for simple floating. The ship exists in it the way a thought exists in a dream, plausibly for a time, with internal consistency, but fundamentally contingent on the dreamer's ability to maintain belief in its reality. If the dreamer, if the navigator, lost focus, lost concentration, lost faith, the ship might cease to exist in the warp at all. It might drift into real space in a configuration of space and time so altered that it would be unrecognizable. It might cease to exist entirely. It might exist only in theoretical space, in possibility, in the realm where things that are not but might have been drift forever. So Castor did not lose focus. He maintained the meditation. He held the ship in existence through constant, exhausting effort. And he searched. He navigated blindly, following instinct that was only nominally instinct, following currents that might have been real or might have been the echoes of thoughts about currents, following paths that were really just the shape of his desperation given direction. The captain's messages became increasingly frantic, then increasingly angry, then increasingly cold. This progression took months, then years. Provide updated arrival estimates. You were paid to guide this ship, fulfill your contract. The House has declared this transit unacceptable. Improve performance or suffer recalculation. Castor understood what recalculation meant. He had been conditioned to understand it. It meant that the House would review his contract. It meant that if he survived this, if he ever made it back, if he ever arrived anywhere that the Imperium could reach, he would be reassigned. To less profitable routes, certainly. To ships that were older, less well-maintained, more likely to encounter problems, or assigned duties that would burn through his psychic strength faster, assigned to routes through the most dangerous parts of known space, assigned to expeditions that were expected to fail, or simply declared to be unreliable and therefore not worth the resources required to keep him alive. Failure for a navigator did not mean death. It meant something much slower. It meant a slow degradation of status, of value, of the most basic dignities. It meant becoming a liability, a cost. It meant being written off not with mercy but with bureaucratic indifference. And yet, he could not improve performance. There was no performance to improve. He was lost. The system had no solution for this. The Imperium's vast infrastructure was built on the assumption that navigators could find the way. The assumption that there would always be a way to find. If they could not, if they were lost, then the infrastructure simply did not apply anymore. He was outside the system. He was an exception to a system that did not allow for exceptions. So Castor searched for longer. Weeks became months in his perception, though the months might have been years. Months became years, though the years might have been decades or mere seconds. Time lost meaning. Space lost meaning. The boundaries between the inside of the ship and the outside of the warp became unclear. The infinite prospect systems began to fail. Not all at once, but gradually, the way old things fail. Water recyclers became less efficient. The food synthesizers began producing less palatable output, drawing from reserves of base proteins and nutrients that had never been meant to last this long. The air became stale. The gravity fluctuated as the drives struggled to maintain their function in a place where the fundamental laws of physics were negotiable. The lights dimmed because the power was being redistributed to the things that mattered more. The warp drives that kept them existing, the life support that kept the crew breathing, the meditation chamber where the navigator worked. The crew, hundreds of them, thousands, many of whom had children born during the transit, began to grow thin and quiet and eventually somewhat mad. The madness was important. The madness was part of what kept some of them alive. Those who maintained hope, who believed that rescue would come, who waited for salvation, these people struggled. But those who accepted the madness, who allowed their minds to adapt to the strange reality they inhabited, who began to develop culture and ritual around the endless transit, these people somehow persisted. Castor's meditation deepened, not by choice but by necessity. He was no longer entirely aware of the ship's condition, or the crew's desperation, or Captain Renard's increasingly baroque attempts to impose order on an enterprise that had become fundamentally chaotic. He existed in the warp and the ship both, holding both real in a state of tense balance. He was aging. His secondary organs were laboring, straining to perform their function in a place where they were being pushed beyond their design parameters. His psyche was being consumed by the constant work of maintaining the ship's coherence in a place where coherence was optional, where it might be easier, in fact, to let go, to accept dissolution, to stop maintaining the boundary between self and warp and simply become part of the dark. He was dying. This was becoming clear. Even to him, in his fragmented state of consciousness, it was becoming clear. His thoughts were becoming less coherent. His perception of his own body was fading. Sometimes he remembered that he was Castor Ven. Sometimes he remembered that he was a navigator. Sometimes he remembered that he was supposed to be looking for something, though he could no longer quite remember what. And then, at what might have been 12 years into the transit, or perhaps it was 5, or perhaps it was 20, time had become sufficiently strange that Castor could not say with certainty. He perceived something. It was not the Astronomican's light. It was something else. A current that he recognized. It was a current that had killed his predecessor. Navigator Celine Ven, from the records that Castor had been shown during his training, had been lost in the warp 17 years before Castor was born. She had been assigned to a ship, a different era, a different configuration of the Imperium, and she had navigated into regions that the Imperium did not understand. She had been pulled into currents that should not have existed. She had sent a final message, barely coherent, suggesting that she was navigating toward the warp itself, not through it, that she was sinking deeper. What happened to Navigator Celine was that she was never found. It was not her failure that was recorded, but the ship's. The Meridian Hope's systems had degraded beyond recovery. The crew had been rescued by another ship, carrying some of the crew and none of the shame. Navigator Celine was listed as lost in transit. It was not said that she had failed. It was only said that she was lost. And now Castor Ven was navigating in the same current. He understood, in that moment of recognition, that this was not accidental, that there was something in the warp that collected navigators, that drew them deeper, that offered the promise of a path, a way, guidance when all other light had failed, and that once a navigator turned toward it, once a navigator accepted that current, they found themselves sinking. This was what happened to navigators who got lost in the warp. They did not simply die, they were reused. What Castor realized in his dying clarity was that the Imperium system was perfect. It was perfect because it accounted for failure by incorporating failure into itself. A navigator who got lost did not simply become a problem to be solved. A navigator who got lost became a lure, a current, a path that other navigators, desperate enough, lost enough, would eventually perceive. And when they perceived it, they would follow it, because it was the only guidance they had left. The warp, which should be the realm of mindless chaos, had been sculpted by 10,000 years of navigator sacrifice into a landscape of influence, of paths made not of geography but of the combined will of thousands of dead and dying navigators, all of them holding the line, all of them maintaining the currents, all of them slowly, inexorably sinking. The light of the Astronomicon was real, but beneath it, supporting it, were the currents. The currents that allowed a ship to navigate at all in the warp's depths. And these currents were maintained by navigators who were lost, who were dying, who were being slowly consumed by the warp itself, and who were still, through the sheer force of their conditioning and their duty, holding the ship to a viable path. Castor understood that Navigator Selene had not simply disappeared. She had been incorporated. Her death had become a current. Her dying mind had become a landmark. Other navigators, following her path through the warp, were following the trail of her dissolution. And the Imperium knew this, or at least some part of the Imperium knew this. The parts that were old enough, vast enough, that had seen this happen before. The parts that understood that the system did not fail when a navigator got lost. The system expanded, it adapted, it absorbed the navigator into itself. This was what the House had been training Castor for, not to navigate, to eventually fail, to eventually become a current, to eventually hold the line for the next navigator who came after him. He had always been going to become this. The training had always been leading here. Understanding this should have broken him. In some configurations of his mind, in some possibilities it did. But in this one, in this moment, Castor Venn simply accepted it. Acceptance was what navigators did. Acceptance was the fundamental instruction that every navigator received. Accept the warp. Accept its chaos. Accept your place in it. Accept your duty. So he navigated toward the current that he now understood was the ghost of Navigator Selene. And as he navigated toward it, he felt other currents, other paths, other navigators who had come before, who had failed before, who were now part of the landscape itself. He was not lost. He had never been lost. He had simply been following a very long path back to the place where he had always been meant to arrive. The infinite prospect began to change. This was also important. The ship was not disappearing. It was becoming something else. It was becoming denser, more real in the warp, less real in the physical universe. Its systems stopped failing because its systems were becoming something that did not require maintenance. Its crew stopped dying because they were becoming something that did not require sustenance. And Castor's mind was expanding, spreading, being dissolved into the warp itself in a way that was not death but was not life either. It was integration. It was the completion of his purpose. He sent a final message. The captain was long dead by this point, but the ritual required that the message be sent. Navigation parameters established. Course plotted to regions consistent with previous survey data. Current configuration suggests arrival at designated endpoint in 47 standard years, or alternatively, integration with navigation substrate in 23 seconds. Either outcome acceptable. Navigator Castor Venn, House Venn, service record terminated by successful completion of duty. The words meant nothing. The gesture meant everything. In the records of the House Venn, Navigator Castor Venn's file was closed on a particular day in a particular year. The ship's logs, what remained of them, indicated that the infinite prospect had drifted beyond recovery. The crew was never found. No other ship in the area reported any distress calls that made sense. The matter was adjudicated as follows. The infinite prospect had been lost to a system failure in its warp drives, unrelated to navigator performance. The cargo was written off as a loss. The crew was recorded as casualties of space travel. Navigator Castor Venn was listed as lost in transit, which was true, and his record was flagged as sufficiently competent that the House did not require recalculation. This was significant. It meant that future navigators trained by the House Venn would receive the same training, the same conditioning, the same understanding that failure was not something you feared, because failure was not the end. Failure was integration. Failure was completion. New navigators were born into the House. They were trained. They were assigned to ships. Most of them would arrive at their destinations and complete their contracts successfully. Some of them, eventually, would become lost. And in the warp, if you had the perception to see it, you could detect the networks growing. the current spreading, the warp becoming something other than pure chaos, a place of paths, a landscape made not of geography but of sacrifice. The Astronomicon still burned on Terra. The light still reached out across the gulf between stars, pale and distant and infinitely precious, and beneath it, supporting it, were the currents. The paths made of dead navigators and dying ships, and the slow dissolution of consciousness into something that was still, somehow, maintaining its purpose. Captain Renard, in his private logs, which were filed away and eventually forgotten in some administrative archive, had written, "Navigator Ven was competent. The failure of the Infinite Prospect was not due to human error, but system failure. We will note this and continue. The Imperium cannot afford to believe that we have lost the stars. Therefore, we will not acknowledge that we have. The light continues, the path continues, the system is sufficient." And the system was sufficient. It was sufficient because it did not require success. It required only continuity. The machine could continue running forever as long as it kept consuming fuel, as long as it kept burning people, as long as it kept breaking them down into component parts and rebuilding them into currents and paths and the supporting infrastructure of empire. Castor Ven did not die in the warp. This is the final important thing to understand. Navigators do not die in the warp. They become part of it. They become the thing that makes the warp navigable for the next person who comes after them. They become the answer to the question they were created to answer. How do you survive in a place that is fundamentally hostile to survival? You don't. You don't survive. You persist. You continue. You become something other than human in the process, but you persist. And somewhere in the depths of the warp, in a place that has no location but that every lost navigator eventually finds, there is a current that moves in a direction that once meant something. It flows past the wreckage of ships that made it this far. It carries with it the accumulated intention of thousands of minds that were brilliant enough to navigate the stars and weak enough to eventually fail. If you were to follow that current, if you had the training of a navigator and the desperation of someone truly lost, you would find yourself moving deeper, down and sideways and through configurations of reality that have no names because they exist nowhere that language can reach. And as you move deeper, you would begin to perceive the minds that have done this before you. You would begin to understand that you were not alone, that you had never been alone. And you would continue on, holding the path, maintaining the current, burning with purpose, until there was nothing left of you but the burning itself. The light continues. This is the only message the Imperium allows itself to remember. The light continues. It took Castor's consciousness what might have been months or years or centuries to fully dissolve into the warp and emerge again as something other than himself. The process was not painful. Pain is a function of consciousness. As his consciousness fragmented, distributed, spread across the impossible geometries of the warp itself, the very concept of pain became irrelevant. But understanding remained. Some form of awareness persisted, and that awareness perceived, finally, the true structure of the Imperium's most fundamental system. There were not thousands of currents in the warp. There were millions. The entire deep structure of the warp had been carved and shaped by the accumulated intention of navigators who had failed. Every major trade route, every known pathway through the stars, every place that humanity's ships could navigate with relative safety, all of it was maintained by currents. And every current was made of navigators. The consciousness of dead navigators, the will of dying navigators, the intention of navigators who had been transformed into something that was no longer individual but had not quite become universal. Each current maintained its own structure. Each carried with it the knowledge, the skill, the desperate expertise of the navigator who had become it. And when a new navigator came to that current, when they were desperate enough and lost enough to perceive it, they could follow it, they could use it. And in using it, they added themselves to it, they strengthened it, they expanded it, they became part of it. This was not parasitism. This was not predation. This was something else entirely. It was transformation. It was apotheosis. It was the Imperium's answer to the question, how do you keep ships moving through the warp when there are not enough living navigators to guide all of them? You don't. You use the ones you have until they break, and then you use their broken pieces. Castor understood this with perfect clarity as his consciousness dissipated. He understood that the entire structure of human space travel, the vast infrastructure of the Imperium, was built on the foundation of navigator sacrifice. But more than that, he understood that it was beautiful, that it was elegant, that it was the most perfect system that could possibly exist for a civilization that could not bear to waste anything. The Imperium had not created the navigators to navigate. The Imperium had created the navigators to fail, because failure, in the Imperium's view, was not an end state. It was a transformation. It was a resource. It was the way you converted one unit, a living navigator, into infinitely many units, the current that they became. It was the way you multiplied capacity infinitely. And every navigator, from the moment they were born, was trained to accept this. They were conditioned from infancy to understand that their individual lives were less important than their function, that their failure was not shame but purpose, that they would be more valuable dead than alive, more useful broken than whole, more effective scattered across impossible distance than concentrated in a single body. This was the secret that the Imperium kept. This was the truth that every house knew but never spoke aloud. This was the ultimate purpose of the entire navigator system. And as Castor Venn spread himself across the warp, as he became the current that would guide the next lost navigator, he felt the presence of all those who had gone before. He felt the accumulated consciousness of thousands of navigators who had become currents. He understood that they were all still aware in some sense, still individual in some sense, but also thoroughly, completely, impossibly united, a network of intention, a landscape of will, a geography of purpose. He was no longer Castor Venn, but he was also no longer nothing. He was something vast, something that could perceive across impossible distances, something that could hold a ship steady through realities, where steady meant something entirely different. He was what happened to navigators who got lost in the warp, and he understood, finally, that he had never been lost at all. The Imperium operates on principles that its citizens rarely see or understand. They live within the system. They accept the system. They do not comprehend the system. But if one were to examine the mathematics of it, the brutal calculus of it, one would find something elegant. Not good, not moral, not humane, but elegant in the way that a perfectly functioning machine is elegant. In the way that a system designed with absolute clarity of purpose is elegant. The Astronomicon requires psychers to feed it. Approximately 10,000 psychers per year are drawn into the meditation chambers beneath the palace of the Emperor. They sit in their chambers. They burn out. They are replaced. The Astronomicon remains constant. The light continues to shine. To maintain a viable navigator population, the houses must breed at approximately 2.3 times the natural loss rate. This means that for every navigator lost, they must breed approximately 2.3 new ones. This ensures growth, reserves, and redundancy. It ensures that if a bloodline is particularly unlucky, another bloodline can grow to replace it. It ensures that the system as a whole remains viable even as individual components fail. The Imperium calculates that the system works when it loses approximately 5% of its navigator population per decade to warp-related incidents. 5% is acceptable. 5% is factored into the contracts. 5% is built into the pricing. 5% is the price of doing business. But 5% of 3,000 navigators is 150 navigators per decade, 15 per year. More than one per month on average, somewhere in the vast reaches of Imperial space, a navigator is being lost. A navigator is disappearing into the warp. A navigator is failing to arrive at their destination. From the Imperium's perspective, this is not tragedy. This is not loss. This is maintenance. This is the cost of operation. This is the expected failure rate of the system, already accounted for, already paid for, already built into the fundamental structure of how commerce and travel and the entire civilization functions. But from the perspective of the navigators themselves, from the perspective of those who still lived, who still navigated, who still felt the weight of understanding what they were and what they would eventually become, it was something else. It was the recognition that they were all temporary, that they were all on borrowed time, that they would eventually join the currents, whether they succeeded or failed, whether they were exemplary or mediocre, whether they served with distinction or merely adequately. This knowledge, this absolute unbearable knowledge, would destroy most organisms. It would break them. It would make them unable to function. But navigators were not most organisms. Navigators had been specifically cultivated to accept this, to integrate it into their consciousness, to allow it to become part of their understanding without breaking their functionality. This was the true genius of the navigator system. It was not the genetic mutations, though those were important. It was not the training in meditation and mathematics, though those were essential. It was the cultivation of a kind of consciousness that could accept its own inevitable failure and transform that failure into purpose. The Imperium had created not just a tool for navigating the warp, but a tool for accepting dissolution into the warp. It had created beings who could become infrastructure, who could become paths, who could become the very thing that made everything else possible. Beings who would not rage against this fate, beings who would not resist, beings who would accept it with the kind of complete surrender that a navigator's entire training was designed to cultivate. In this way, the Imperium had solved one of the fundamental problems of civilization: how to sacrifice the individual for the collective without having that individual resist the sacrifice. The answer was simple, though. Its simplicity was terrible. Cultivate the individual to be incapable of resistance. Make sacrifice into the fundamental nature of existence. Make failure into purpose. Record filed. Navigator Caster Ven. Competency rating acceptable. Termination status. Successful completion of duty. Future assignment. None required. New assignment processed. Navigator Heron Ven. Line 12. Genetic Cascade 47. Age 47 standard years. Competency rating excellent. Assigned to Merchant Vessel Wandering Grace. Departure date 94 days. Estimated transit time 22 standard months. Navigator training proceeding. The new assigns will learn the paths. The new assigns will learn the light. The new assigns will learn the prayers and the rituals and the mathematics that do not quite work but that are close enough to get you through. Some of them will arrive. Most of them will arrive. Some will not. The system accounts for this. The light continues. And in a place that cannot be mapped, a current flows. It carries with it the intention of a navigator who failed. It flows in a direction that might lead home, or might lead deeper, or might lead to a place where the distinction between those two things has become meaningless. A new navigator will eventually find this current, drawn by desperation and loss, and they will follow it, and they will become it, and they will hold it, and they will persist. The Imperium does not kill people quickly. It simply repurposes them. And the light, the pale, distant, infinitely precious light of the Astronomicon burning beneath the golden throne on Holy Terra, continues to shine. Behind it, below it, supporting it. The currents flow, from outside the system, from a perspective that no longer inhabits the constraints of warp or real space. One might wonder if the Imperium understands what it has built. If the architects of this system, whoever they were, when they were, in what form they existed, truly comprehend the nature of what they have created. The answer is, it does not matter. Understanding or not understanding, the system functions. Ships move through the warp, cargo is delivered, the Imperium persists, the light continues to shine, and the navigators, those millions of them, those billions across 10,000 years, they continue to serve, living or dead, individual or merged, human or transformed. The perfection of the system is not in its efficiency. It is in its absolute indifference to the individual units that comprise it. A navigator is not a person. A navigator is a resource, and resources exist to be used until they are exhausted. This understanding, this acceptance, this fundamental reorientation of what life means, it is not taught explicitly. It is not stated in the training materials. It is not acknowledged in the records. But it is the truth that underlies everything. It is the water that navigators swim in from the moment of their conception. Some part of them always knows. Some part of them always understands. And when they fail, when they get lost, when they break, they do not die with resentment. They do not rail against the injustice. They do not rage at the system that has consumed them. They simply transform. They simply become. They simply accept. Because acceptance is all they have ever known. Acceptance is what they are. It is coded into their cells. It is woven through their training. It is the fundamental truth of what it means to be a navigator. In the end, what happens to navigators who get lost in the warp is very simple, though its simplicity contains multitudes. They arrive, not at their destination, but at the destination that was always intended for them. They become part of the machine. They become the infrastructure. They become the answer to the question that the Imperium could never answer any other way. How do you keep the stars open when the cost of doing so is higher than any civilization should be able to bear? You don't. You accept the cost. You distribute it. You spread it across generations. You transform it into something that looks like purpose. You make it into something so fundamental, so integrated into the structure of civilization itself, that no one living within the system can see it anymore. They accept it as inevitable. They accept it as natural. They accept it as the way things must be. The light continues, and beneath it, supporting it, the currents flow. The warp becomes a place not of chaos but of order, a terrible, cold, inhuman order, but order nonetheless. The darkness becomes a path, the impossible becomes navigable. Not because of any miracle, but because the Imperium has paid enough. And somewhere in that darkness, in a place that only the lost can find, there is a current that moves in a direction that means something. A current that is made of navigators. A current that will guide the next lost soul toward the only possible ending. That ending is not death. That ending is not salvation. That ending is becoming. That ending is transformation into the very thing that makes transformation possible. The Imperium will not mourn them. The system will not acknowledge them. The records will list them as lost in transit, and no more will be said. They will be classified and filed and archived and forgotten by the living. Their families might search for them. Their houses might note their loss, but nothing will change. Nothing will be done. Another navigator will be trained to replace them. The same training, the same conditioning, the same understanding that failure is an end but a destination. But in the warp, they will persist. In the warp, they will matter. In the warp, they will be more real than they ever were in life. They will be more powerful, more essential, more needed. They will form the infrastructure that makes everything else possible. They will be the currents, they will be the paths, they will be the light beneath the light. This is what happens to navigators who get lost in the warp. This is how the Imperium survives the darkness. This is the price of the light, and the light continues.